Chapter 1. The Silent Existence. The atmosphere of Itheron V had long been suffocating in its silence, a planet orbiting a star that had seen better days. For centuries, Itheron V had remained a forgotten speck on the galactic map, tucked away in a corner where most would never venture, and the few who did were often too weary to stay for long. The surface of the planet was shrouded in thick, dark clouds that blocked out the light of the distant sun, turning the sky into a murky gray that stretched endlessly in all directions. Beneath this oppressive sky, the land was barren, scorched by decades of neglect. Once green fields had turned into cracked earth, and the grand cities, now only shadows of their former selves, were filled with abandoned buildings, rusted structures, and crumbling roads. It was a place that bore the weight of history, not the kind of history that was celebrated, but the kind that left scars. It had been a place of prosperity once, a shining example of what could be achieved, until greed, corruption, and carelessness took over, leaving behind nothing but the hushed remnants of a dying civilization. Among the forgotten inhabitants of Itheron V, there was a young alien woman named Erin. She was one of the many who had been born into this fractured, desolate world. Her skin, pale and almost translucent, shimmered faintly in the dim light of the streets. Her long, silvery hair cascaded like a river of light down her back, and her features, though delicate and beautiful by the standards of her kind, were now etched with weariness and sorrow. Erin had grown up knowing the bitterness of a world that had no place for people like her, a world where her beauty was the only thing that could give her any worth. And yet, even that had been taken from her. The Etherians were known throughout the galaxy for their grace, their ethereal beauty, and their otherworldly charm, but none of that mattered when the city streets were filled with the discarded lives of those who could not fit into the rigid, hierarchical structure of Itheron V. The rich and powerful resided in gleaming spires that reached into the clouds, their pristine homes and gardens untouched by the decay that had taken hold of the lower levels of the city. These elite few were untouched by the horrors of the slums, where the rest of the population lived in squalor. In the depths of the city, in the shadowed corners where no one bothered to look, the poor, the broken, and the unwanted were left to fend for themselves. It was a place where people like Erin, the ones who did not meet the standards of beauty or usefulness, were abandoned. Erin had learned early on that her beauty was a double-edged sword, one that had initially given her some semblance of status and attention, but ultimately had only led her to a life of being used, traded, and discarded. Her family had sold her off at a young age, believing that her beauty would be a means to secure a better life for themselves. But beauty, on Itheron V, was a commodity, and once it had been bought, it was consumed quickly and ruthlessly. Erin had been sold to the highest bidder in one of the city's underground markets, a place where the elite bought and sold the bodies of the young and beautiful. She had been used, abandoned when her value had diminished, and left to wander the streets like so many others who had no worth beyond their physical appearance. As the years went by, Erin had learned to keep her distance from others. She didn't dare trust anyone, because anyone who came into her life, whether they were rich or poor, saw her as an object to be used, an accessory, a prize to be won. The lower levels of the city were filled with the remnants of people who had been broken by a system that never cared for them. The streets were littered with the bodies of those who had given up, their lives now just memories that the city would soon forget. The air was thick with despair, and Erin could feel the weight of it in her chest every day. It was a feeling she had grown accustomed to, one that settled into her bones and made it hard to breathe, as though the city itself was crushing her under its weight. She had no friends, no family to turn to. Her days were spent moving through the city like a shadow, unnoticed by those who walked past her. She didn't matter to anyone. She was nothing more than an empty shell of the person she had once been. She had once had dreams, hopes for a better life, but those dreams had long since died. Now, all she could do was survive. Each day was just another endless cycle of walking the streets, searching for something, anything, to fill the emptiness inside of her. There were moments when Erin wondered what her life might have been like if she had been born somewhere else, somewhere that cared for its people, somewhere where beauty wasn't a currency to be traded and discarded. But that was a dream too far away, a dream she couldn't afford to have anymore. She had learned to live in the moment, to focus on what was right in front of her. And what was in front of her, day after day, was the harsh reality of Itheron V. The people who lived here, the ones who still had something to fight for, were no different from her. They were all struggling, all trying to hold on to something in a world that had long since abandoned them. One cold evening, as the city's lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the streets, Aaron sat on a crumbling bench in a forgotten park, staring blankly at the horizon. The faint glow of the dying sun barely filtered through the thick clouds overhead, casting a dull gray light over everything. She had no particular place to go, no purpose beyond the simple need to survive. But something in the stillness of the moment made her feel as though she had come to a crossroads, as though this was the moment that everything might change. And that was when it happened. As she sat there, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the bench, something caught her eye. A figure emerged from the shadows, someone she hadn't seen before. He wasn't wearing the usual clothing of the people in the lower levels. His clothes were simple, but they weren't the rags that most of the others wore. His posture was different, too, straight and strong, as though he carried the weight of something more than just his own survival. He wasn't looking at her, not yet, but as he passed by, something in his gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary. For a brief second, their eyes met, and Aaron felt a sudden jolt of something she hadn't felt in years: recognition. It was so fleeting that she almost dismissed it, but it was there. And then, as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. But that fleeting glance was enough to ignite something within her, something she hadn't realized was still there. The next day, the man returned, this time walking toward her with a deliberate stride, as though he had made a decision. Aaron, still sitting on the same bench, looked up as he approached, unsure of what to expect. He stopped in front of her, his face calm but somehow reassuring. His eyes, unlike the cold, calculating gazes of those around her, seemed to hold something like compassion, something that was foreign in a place like this. "You don't belong here," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I can tell." Aaron blinked in surprise, not sure how to respond. She had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, of making herself invisible to the world around her. But this man had seen her, really seen her, and that terrified her more than anything else. She quickly averted her eyes, afraid that if she looked at him for too long, the walls she had built around herself would come crashing down. "I'm just trying to survive," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he knelt down in front of her, lowering himself to her level. The simple act of him kneeling before her, showing that kind of respect, felt almost alien in a world where everyone was so focused on their own survival. "What's your name?" he asked. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever asked her that before, not in years. No one had cared to know who she was. She opened her mouth, but for the first time in a long time, she found herself unable to speak. "Aaron," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Aaron." The man nodded slowly, as though the name held weight. "Aaron," he repeated, his voice soft but filled with an unspoken promise. "I'm here to help. I know what this place does to people, but you don't have to be like this. You don't have to be invisible." Aaron's heart raced as his words sank in. Help. It had been so long since anyone had even thought to offer her help. She had long ago resigned herself to the fact that no one cared about people like her. But here was this man, someone who didn't know her, who had no reason to care, and yet he was offering something she hadn't felt in so long: kindness. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve anything. No one cares for people like me." He shook his head gently. "That's where you're wrong. You do deserve something. You deserve a life, Aaron, and I'm here to help you find it." In that moment, something shifted within her, something deep and profound. For the first time in her life, Aaron felt as though she had been seen for who she truly was, not just for her beauty, not just as an object to be discarded, but as a person. And that, more than anything, changed everything. For weeks, Aaron wandered the streets of Itheron V, always avoiding the gazes of the people she passed. Each step was deliberate, each motion automatic, as she moved through the dull, gray city like a ghost. The world had no place for her. The lights of the upper levels seemed to mock her, glowing brightly above her while she trudged through the darkness below. The grand palaces and extravagant mansions of the elite were built with such beauty and care, while the slums where she lived were dilapidated, dark, and suffocating. Despite the beauty she was born with, Aaron had never been valued for it. She had been raised to be nothing more than a commodity, her beauty a means to an end, something that would eventually be sold, bartered, and discarded. It had taken her years to realize that she was never seen for her true self. She was just another product in a system built on exploitation. And in this world, beauty was a weapon, one that could be wielded against her, used to control her, to strip away her humanity until there was nothing left but the empty shell of a woman. The market in the lower city was where most of the discarded lived, where those who had no use to the powerful were abandoned. Here, Aaron moved among the crowds, blending in with those who had no face and no voice. The traders in the market dealt in many things: goods, food, information, but the real currency was something darker. And it wasn't just beauty that was traded. It was life, hope, and, most cruelly of all, dignity. She had learned not to speak unless spoken to, not to make eye contact with anyone who might remind her of what she had lost. Her heart, once full of the innocence of a child, had been hollowed out over the years, and she had begun to carry the weight of the world on her slender shoulders. Every corner of the city, every shadow that stretched from the cracked buildings, reminded her that no one cared. No one noticed. And yet, something in her heart still flickered, a tiny, stubborn ember of hope that refused to die. She had seen others give up, sink into despair, but she couldn't quite bring herself to let go of the idea that there was something more for her out there, even if she couldn't see it. She had dreams, quiet, elusive dreams of a life that wasn't dictated by survival alone. But those dreams were fleeting, like the last light of day before the night swallowed it up. On the rare occasions when she was able to sleep, Erin would dream of a world far away from Itheron V. She would dream of green fields and clear skies, of laughter and warmth. It was a dream she knew was impossible, but still, she held on to it. She dreamed of someone who would see her as she truly was, not a commodity, not a thing to be used, but a person deserving of kindness, of love, of respect. But those dreams always ended when she woke, and when her eyes opened, the harsh reality of her world flooded back in. And so, the days passed in a blur of muted sounds, darkened alleyways, and broken dreams. Erin had become a part of the city's rhythm, a figure who moved through the streets without ever being truly seen. She had learned to disappear, to blend into the background. No one cared enough to ask her name, to wonder about her life. She was just another face in the crowd, another lost soul in a city full of them. Chapter 2. A Glimpse of Change. It was a day like any other when the change began. Erin had spent the morning walking the familiar path through the lower levels, her feet dragging as she made her way to a food stall in the corner of the market. She wasn't hungry, but it had become a ritual, buying something, anything, just to pass the time, just to have a moment of normalcy. The vendor was a gruff old man with a thick beard and a crooked smile. He barely looked at her as he handed her a small parcel of dried fruit, his calloused fingers quick and efficient. She exchanged the little amount of credits she had left, nodded, and moved on. As she turned to leave, she caught something in the corner of her eye, a figure moving against the flow of the crowd. This was nothing unusual. In Itheron V, there were always strangers weaving through the streets, people coming and going. But there was something about this figure that caught her attention. The man stood out tall, with an air of confidence and purpose that immediately drew her gaze. His clothes were simple, but they were well maintained, and he carried himself with an ease that suggested he wasn't like the others around her. He stopped suddenly, his gaze scanning the crowd as though looking for something or someone. Erin froze in place, instinctively retreating into the shadows of a nearby building, trying to avoid being seen. She didn't belong here, and strangers never looked twice at people like her. They either ignored you or passed by, seeing only the dirty streets or the desperate faces. But this man, this stranger, seemed to be looking directly at her. His eyes swept across the crowd, briefly meeting hers. For a split second, time seemed to slow, and Erin felt her heart skip a beat. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even recognition, that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. Before she could look away, he took a step toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. Erin's heart raced. What did he want? Why was he walking toward her? She had no time to think, no time to act. She could feel her breath quickening, her body tense with the anxiety of being noticed. When he was only a few feet away, he stopped, his gaze still locked with hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Erin wondered if he would just pass her by like everyone else. But then, in a voice softer than she expected, he spoke. You look like you need a place to go. Aaron blinked, unsure of how to respond. His words, simple as they were, cut through the years of silence and isolation she had grown used to. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not in a way that showed any concern or care. She stammered, unsure of what to say. I'm fine. He didn't seem convinced. I don't think you are, he replied, his voice gentle but insistent. You're not alone, you know. Aaron felt something stir within her, a flicker of hope, but it was quickly drowned by the heavy weight of her reality. No one cared. She had heard those words before, empty promises, hollow words spoken by people who didn't understand, who didn't know what it was like to live in a place like this. But this man, he didn't seem like the others. There was something about him, something different. His eyes weren't filled with pity, nor was there any judgment in his gaze. There was only kindness. And it was in that moment that Aaron felt the first real spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of change. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to believe it. I don't need help, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to convince herself as much as him. I'm fine. I've always been fine. The man's expression softened, and for the first time in her life, Aaron felt like someone truly saw her. Not just as a passing face or an object, but as a person, a real person. You don't have to be fine, he said quietly. Sometimes, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to need help. And it's okay to ask for it. Aaron felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes welling up with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She looked away, afraid that he might see the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to show him that she was human, that she needed someone, anyone. But the man, sensing her hesitation, took a small step closer. My name is Jonas. I'm not going to ask you to trust me right away. But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Jonas. His name rang in her ears like a promise that she couldn't quite bring herself to believe in. She had spent so many years closing herself off, building walls around her heart, that she didn't know how to open them again. But something about his words, about his presence, felt like a lifeline. Aaron took a deep breath, pushing down the emotions threatening to spill over. Aaron, she said softly. My name is Aaron. Jonas smiled, the warmth of it making her chest ache. It's nice to meet you, Aaron. If you ever need help, you know where to find me. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Aaron standing there in the street, her heart beating fast as she tried to process the encounter. Something had shifted in her. She didn't know what it was, but for the first time in years, she felt seen, felt like she wasn't just a shadow, but someone worthy of care. The encounter with Jonas was a momentary flicker in the otherwise dark landscape of her life, but it felt like the first spark of something much larger, something that could change everything. Aaron stood still for a moment, unsure of how to react. She had been prepared to walk through the marketplace as she always did, eyes lowered, trying to avoid any unwanted attention. But here, in front of her, was Jonas, the very person who had spoken to her like she was more than just a shadow on the streets. Her breath caught in her chest, and for a second, she almost turned to leave. She wasn't used to people seeing her, let alone approaching her with such warmth. But something in Jonas's expression stopped her. There was no pity in his eyes, no judgment, only genuine kindness and curiosity. He wasn't looking at her as a beggar or an object to be used, but as a person. The weight of those years of feeling invisible, of existing in a world where no one cared, seemed to lift for a fleeting moment. The world around her seemed to fade, and for the first time, Aaron wasn't worried about being rejected or discarded. She wasn't alone in this moment. She stepped closer, the hard walls she'd spent years building around herself still present, but beginning to soften with every step. I didn't think I'd see you again, Aaron said, her voice a little quieter than she intended, a mixture of awe and caution. Jonas smiled again, that warm, easy smile that somehow made her feel safe. I don't know why, but I felt like I should come back. I didn't mean to catch you off guard. Aaron nodded, unsure of what to say next. She had grown accustomed to the routine of her life, where words were few, and the space between them and others was infinite. But here, now, with Jonas standing before her, everything seemed different. For a moment, she forgot the harsh realities of Itheron V, the dying city, the streets full of hunger, the constant battle to remain unnoticed. Jonas's expression softened, as though he could sense her unease. You know, if you ever need a place to stay or someone to talk to, you don't have to do this alone. I can help. It's not much, but Erin interrupted him, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. I don't know how to accept help. I've never had anyone offer before. Her voice trembled, betraying the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. She had never been offered kindness without some kind of hidden agenda, and it scared her to think that this might be too good to be true. Was he just offering empty words, like everyone else? Or was there something different about Jonas, something that made him stand out from the rest? Jonas, sensing her hesitation, took a small step forward, his hands held up in a peaceful gesture. I'm not here to judge you, Erin. You don't have to accept anything if you're not ready. But you're not invisible to me. Not like the others. I don't know your story, and I'm not going to pretend I understand what you've been through. But I'm offering you something real, a chance to talk, to share what's been weighing on you. You deserve that. No one should feel like they're alone in this world. Erin's chest tightened at his words. She had lived in silence for so long, carried the weight of her existence alone, and yet, here was someone who was offering her something she had long given up on, the chance to be heard. She could feel the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart starting to crumble, piece by piece. She had never been told that she was worth listening to, that her pain mattered. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope that perhaps she wasn't as invisible as she thought. I don't know if I can just open up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've lived my life keeping everything locked away. Jonas nodded, his expression understanding. I get it. I really do. But sometimes, sharing even a little of what's on our minds can be a step towards something better. And when you're ready, I'm here. Erin hesitated for a moment longer, the weight of his kindness pressing against her chest. She didn't know if she was ready to share her pain, her loneliness, with him. It felt too raw, too much to expose after years of burying it deep within herself. But something in his eyes told her that it wouldn't scare him away, that he wasn't like the others who had come and gone in her life. Thank you, she finally said, her voice small but sincere. Maybe one day. Jonas's smile grew, and he nodded in understanding. That's all I'm asking for. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Erin standing there in the quiet of the marketplace, her heart racing. She watched him disappear into the crowd, and for the first time in years, Erin felt a spark of something she thought had been lost forever, a sense of possibility. Chapter 3. A Path to Change. The days that followed were a blur of quiet reflection and cautious optimism. Erin found herself thinking about Jonas more and more, his words echoing in her mind as she walked through the streets of Itheron V. She couldn't understand why he had come into her life, why he had chosen to speak to her when he could have just walked by like everyone else. What did he see in her? She wasn't anyone special. She wasn't a hero or someone important in the grand scheme of things. She was just a woman trying to survive in a broken world. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps he saw something in her that she couldn't see: herself, potential, strength, the ability to change. Maybe she had spent so much time feeling invisible that she had forgotten what it was like to be seen for who she truly was. Jonas had done that, even with his brief encounter. He had seen her not as a commodity, not as something to be used or discarded, but as a person with a past, a story, and a future. Erin hadn't expected to feel this way. She hadn't expected anyone to care enough to offer her help, to offer her a way out of the loneliness that had consumed her for so long. She had thought her life would always be like this, surviving, never truly living. But Jonas's kindness had cracked the shell she had built around herself, and now, she wasn't sure how to handle the flood of emotions that came rushing in. Days turned into weeks, and though Erin kept to her usual routines, she found herself waiting for Jonas to appear again, hoping for another glimpse of the person who had shown her a glimmer of what life could be like beyond survival. And one day, when she least expected it, he did. Jonas appeared at the edge of the marketplace again, this time not by chance, but with purpose. He was waiting for her, standing near the same corner where they had first met. Erin's heart fluttered in her chest as she saw him, but she didn't hesitate this time. She walked toward him, her steps more confident, her gaze more open. I've been thinking about what you said, Erin began as she approached him, her voice steadier than she felt. And I think I'm ready to listen, to talk. Jonas's face lit up with a quiet smile. I'm glad to hear that, Erin. Whenever you're ready, I'm here. And if you want to talk, I'm all ears. For the first time in years, Erin felt the weight of her past lighten, even if just a little. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, or how much it would change her. But she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. And that, in itself, was enough to begin the journey of transformation. Over the next several days, Aaron met Jonas almost every afternoon. They would find quiet spots in the marketplace or in the park where no one would interrupt them, and he would patiently listen as she spoke. At first, it was difficult for her to open up, to put her thoughts and feelings into words. She had spent so long keeping everything locked away that she wasn't sure how to begin. But Jonas was patient, never rushing her, allowing her to take her time. Slowly, bit by bit, she began to share her story about growing up in the shadows of Itheron V, about how her beauty had been sold and commodified, and about how she had learned to hide herself in plain sight, to become invisible to protect what was left of her soul. Jonas never interrupted, never judged her. He listened, really listened, and in his quiet way, he validated her experiences. He reassured her that it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't deserved what had happened to her. He showed her a kindness she had never known, one that didn't come with strings attached. He didn't want anything from her. He just wanted to help her, to show her that she could be more than the broken parts of her past. As they continued to talk, Erin began to feel a shift inside herself. It was subtle at first, but it was real. The heavy burden of silence she had carried for so long started to loosen, and the walls around her heart began to crumble. With each word she shared, she felt herself healing, bit by bit. It wasn't an easy process. There were still days when the weight of her past threatened to pull her back into the shadows, but she felt stronger. She was starting to believe that she didn't have to live in the dark forever. She could step into the light. One afternoon, as they sat in the park under the dim light of the dying sun, Erin glanced at Jonas and found that for the first time in years, she could meet someone's eyes without fear. She wasn't just looking for approval anymore. She was looking at him as a person who had changed her life, and she could finally say with honesty, "Thank you for seeing me." Jonas smiled softly, his eyes warm. "You don't need to thank me, Erin. You've always been here, even if you couldn't see it. I just helped you find what was already inside of you." She nodded, her chest tight with the emotion that had been building within her. She had never allowed herself to believe that she could have a future, that she could have something more than this barren existence. But now, in Jonas's presence, the world seemed different. It felt full of possibilities she had never even considered before. Perhaps she could leave Itheron V. Perhaps she could find a place where she didn't have to hide, where she wasn't just another lost soul in a forgotten city. The idea of a life beyond these streets, beyond this life of survival, was still a distant dream, but it no longer felt impossible. With Jonas by her side, she began to imagine a life where she could be free, where she could be herself. The days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened. Erin began to feel the first stirrings of something she had long since buried: hope. It wasn't the wild, unrealistic hope of a dreamer, but the kind of hope that came from within, from the knowledge that she was no longer alone. She didn't have to face the world by herself anymore. One evening, as they walked along the edge of the city's broken walls, Erin stopped and looked out at the horizon. The sun was just setting, casting an orange glow across the desolate landscape. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. She felt the weight of the future in her hands, a future that was still uncertain, but not as bleak as it had once seemed. "I think I'm ready," Erin said softly, turning to Jonas. "Ready to leave?" Jonas stopped walking, his eyes searching hers for a moment, and then he nodded. "I'll help you. Wherever you want to go, we'll find a way." Erin's heart swelled with gratitude. She hadn't expected to find someone who would offer her this kind of opportunity, someone who would walk beside her into the unknown. But here Jonas was, offering her everything she had longed for: freedom, a new start, a chance to live without fear. And as she stood there, looking at the broken world around her, Erin knew that leaving wasn't just about escaping. It was about reclaiming her life, about choosing to live again. Chapter 4: The New Beginning. The day Erin left Itheron V was a quiet one, filled with a sense of finality. She stood at the edge of the city, gazing back at the crumbling buildings and the empty streets she had known her entire life. She had spent so many years trapped here, surviving in a place that had never cared about her, never seen her. But today she was free. Jonas stood beside her, his presence a steady comfort. He had helped her arrange everything: a new identity, new papers, and a ship that would take them off the planet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them away from Itheron V, away from the life that had held her captive for far too long. As the ship ascended into the sky, leaving the dying planet behind, Erin looked out the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure where they were going, but for the first time in a long time, the future seemed full of promise. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. She had Jonas by her side, and together, they were heading into the unknown. The stars outside the ship seemed to shimmer with possibilities, and for the first time in years, Erin allowed herself to dream. Dream of a life where she could be more than just a survivor, where she could be a person again, where her worth wasn't determined by what others saw in her, but by who she truly was. As the ship moved through the endless void, Erin looked at Jonas, her eyes filled with gratitude. He had shown her what it meant to be seen, to be cared for. He had given her the chance to reclaim her life, to find herself again. And in that moment, Erin knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers to shape. And that was all she needed. With a deep breath, Erin turned back to the stars, her heart lighter than it had ever been. The past no longer had the power to hold her. She was free, and this was just the beginning of her new life.